Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Billy Keels. Now, for many years, Billy burned the candles at both ends in sales in the enterprise software industry. He was working early mornings and late evenings to build his dream of financial freedom. However, after a few life events and despite a healthy six-figure salary, he realized it was time to close the curtains on his corporate career. Let's go check out his story. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Billy Keels. Billy is the founder of First Generation Capital Partners, where he helps busy, high-paid professionals take control of their life and wealth through unique cash-flowing, tax-efficient direct investments. Now, he's also the host of the Going Long podcast, where each week he chats with experts and investors on how to obtain financial freedom via long-distance real estate investing in U.S.-based real assets. Now, Billy's story is one of revelation and persistence, so I'm really excited to have him join the show. So, hi, Billy. How you doing?
Brian, what's up, man? I'm super excited to be here to chat with you. I am feeling very, very fortunate and blessed for having been able to wake up this morning being safe and sound and healthy.
I like that,
and I'm looking forward to a positive conversation, and maybe we can help to give one person, at least one person out there, a new idea that they can put into action today and start getting closer to the lifestyle that they're really, really desiring to live.
I like that. No, I appreciate that. And amen to that too, because I'm happy I woke up this morning as well. So now, before we get into talking about, your exit from the workforce during that pandemic, would love to just get a little background on you and tell us about your upbringing and where your home is now.
Yeah, sure, man. So my home today is, although the accent is from the U.S., so Columbus, Ohio, I call Europe, specifically Barcelona, Spain, is where I have been residing for the last 17 years. Time flies, man. Since 2005, I've been living here. So I guess maybe it's closer to 18 years here in a couple months, or depending on when you're listening to this, it could be even longer or right just when it's released. So grew up in a very middle class, lower middle class family, watched my parents work 2-3 jobs. Sometimes we never talked about money at the dinner table because it was, when money came up, it was always a difficult subject. And so what my parents always knew was important was for me and my brother and sister to get really good grades, like study a lot, get good grades. To be able to get good grades, then that would get us into a good college. Once we got to a good college, continue to study, get good grades, and that would get us a good job. And so I followed that path because it was one of those things that I saw what they were doing, how much physical labor and work they were putting in. And the thing that they were telling us was that we didn't want to do that. I recognized it because I saw how tiring it was. I saw how exhausting mentally and sometimes even emotionally it was for them. And so I studied hard. And what that meant is went to college, got 2 degrees. After the 2 degrees, I went out for my dream job. Unfortunately, Brian, I was shot down the very first time I went for my dream job. And so I decided to add a second degree. So I lived overseas. Very first time I was overseas, I lived in Valencia, Spain. And I went back having international experience, spoke a new language, sort of. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to apply for that job again because it was like my dream job, my dream company. Like that's everything that I worked for. And so when I applied the second time, having this international experience, language, plus all the first degree, I got shot down a second time. And so that was a really, really tough thing for me to deal with, not only being rejected once, but twice. But what I decided to do was, rather than kind of just stay flat on the mat, so to speak, and be knocked out, I would look for another opportunity. Fortunately, I had a really good friend from college, a guy named Andy, shouts out to Andy, who told me about this job of people who were working and traveling around the world. And so there were about 6,000 candidates who applied for this role during the 1996 Olympic Games. I was one of 26 that was selected. And it's not so much the fact that I was selected one of 26, but it was a fact of what happened for me after that. And although I was dejected, down in the dumps, having been rejected not once, but twice for my dream job, this new role opened up my world to something like I had never even imagined. The reason I say that, Brian, is in 5 years, this role gave me the opportunity to work and travel throughout some 58 different countries, interacting with CEOs, to, frontline sales and operations people from around the globe. Completely changed my perspective, gave me the motivation to do something a little bit different. I didn't want to do the normal 9 to 5, although I wanted to take a 1-year sabbatical. I did that in 2001. But I maintained all those corporate contacts, right? Because a lot of the people I met during those 5 years in 58 countries said, hey, listen, if you ever want a job, give us a call, come back, blah, blah, blah. And so I was young enough and a little bit wild enough to pick up the phone and call some of those people. And I was very fortunate because I had the opportunity to actually stay in Europe. It wasn't just a 1-year sabbatical. I ended up working for a IT company in the hardware space in the south of France. That gave me the opportunity to get back into the IT industry as well as stay in Europe. Worked, perfected my French. I had a chance to move, worked on a Spanish speaking team. I then had the opportunity to lead and build an Italian sales team living in Sardinia, which was pretty amazing. And then after that life experience, had a chance to go back to France, eventually moved to Spain. And when I moved to Spain in 2005, I was very, very fortunate. Met a fantastic person for many, many years. We have 2 children together. And so 2 boys that were born here in Barcelona. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but, I did 26 years in the corporate game, from hardware on the IT side into enterprise software space. Really, really had an amazing opportunity, liked it, learned a lot of great life skills, made great contacts. But that lasted for just so long. And then I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in December of 2021, it was time for me to kind of exit stage left. And after the pandemic, I had a couple things that really became crystal clear to me. And I'm sure you and I can talk a little bit more about that. But that's how this guy from Columbus, Ohio, ended up having a couple failure events and really trying to figure out life. Ended up living in Europe for the last 22 or so years.
Yeah.
And I'm going from there, man.
No, that's great to hear. And what's interesting, you're my third guest from Columbus who I've had on the show. So it's something about
Get out of here.
me in Columbus, right? Like we got Jennifer Walton was in season 1. We had Gamal Harding in season 1. And so something about me in Columbus, I got like an attraction with them. So
there you go.
And I'm a Midwest guy too. So, I got a lot of love for the space. And,
awesome.
And so, you talked about being in the sales industry. What were some of the things that really drove you or you were passionate about professionally that kind of kept you in that realm?
In the beginning, and I think a lot of times people are drawn to sales because, you can potentially make a lot of money, right? Or at least what I used to think was a lot of money. You can make a lot of money in sales and stuff like that. And coming from a family that money was always a problem, I'd done some door-to-door sales, like selling knives door-to-door. Believe it or not, I'm kind of showing my age a little bit, but back in the day, I was selling cutlery door-to-door. And
I know the knives you're talking about too.
Okay, all right, yeah. So some of my family and friends still have those knives. Yeah. I used to cut a rope and cut pennies and all that other kind of stuff. Anybody who knows about it, you will know what we're talking about.
Yes.
So it started there. Really was about being able to make money initially because I wanted to escape from that pain of what I saw at home growing up. But what eventually I loved and still love about the sales profession in general, and whether that's you're doing sales on the front line or you are leading sales professionals, is the fact that you, as a sales professional, you have the opportunity to do something that most people don't get to do every day. And that's help people solve problems. And it's solving their problems. Sometimes, Brian, I'll say that, we're solving first world problems. Well, yeah, they may be first world problems, but if they're your problems, they feel more important than anything else in the world. And as a sales professional, and I was working in an enterprise space, so it was extremely complicated. It was never just one point of contact. There were always multiple different people, whether it was someone in marketing or someone in finance or the chief executive officer themselves that had an opinion. But at the end of the day, what it was that I loved and continue to love about the sales profession is the fact that ultimately, based on the value of the problem that you are helping someone else to solve, number one, you can help them solve their problem. And then as a result, you are compensated or not for being able to help them resolve that problem. So it's really understanding the individual and or companies that are in front of you, helping to really understand what the challenge is, and then being able to map that back to whatever your solution is to help them make the ultimate informed decision. And if that is your solution, then it's your solution. If it's someone else's solution, then it's someone else's solution. But ultimately, being able to help solve problems and help others make informed decisions.
No, I like that. So would love to take you back, right? Because obviously this show got its origins during the pandemic. And so I want to take you back to March of 2020 now, where we're really introduced to COVID. Now you're in Barcelona at this time. And so would love to kind of hear, it was kind of this wave coming from Europe and then eventually to the US, well, Asia, then Europe, then the US. Talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected you while you were over there.
Yeah, it's really interesting that we talk about this because I think just in general, even from a life perspective, the pandemic really had a major effect on not just so many other people's lives that were here in Spain, but personally on my life, right? And what I mean by that was I was working, number one, in an industry that was the hospitality industry. And so that industry and I'm talking about from a work perspective, right? From a work perspective, that industry here in Spain was completely shut down. Like literally, if you owned a hotel, unless it was being used for medical purposes, it was literally shut down. So if you can imagine companies that are making multiple billions of dollars or euros one day, and the next day by government decree, they can't even open their doors. I mean, that's dealing with crisis situation, number one, right? That's from a work perspective. And then also from the home perspective, it was a matter of, our children were going to school every day. And here in Spain, we were on a severe lockdown. So we weren't even able to go outside to go running, right? I remember doing exercise with my kids every day inside watching YouTube videos so that we could at least get the kids to do a little bit of exercise. And I was getting some exercise and things like that. So, that was a real inflection point. And so as I look back on it, March, even through June, because I think we weren't even really able to leave the house until probably late April, early May, like literally shut down. You started to learn a lot. I started learning a lot about the things that I wanted to be able to do, things that I wanted to be able to do less. It was a great time for being able to not only be with family, but it also drove a lot. I think it did for many people, a lot of additional pressures in terms of how you're performing at the office. It also inspired me. I will tell you this. One of the things that I was inspired to do during that very challenging time was to start a podcast, right? Because I had been giving myself so many excuses while I was a sales leader and a sales executive and traveling around and, hey, I'm going to start it tomorrow. But then there was always the next big thing that came up at the office. And I thought, you know what, if I want to do something for my family, for my legacy, for us to be able to do something different, now being locked in the house, literally locked in the house, like can't do anything else. If I'm not going to start a podcast now, when was I ever going to start it? And so everything from the impact on family, the inspiration to start a podcast, and going through crisis situations with clients on a daily basis that went from revenues at the best ever to zero overnight, were all different things that impacted me and the different decisions that I made during that point in time. And that afterwards we can talk a little bit more about one of the things that helped to inspire me to move on from the multinational, but it goes back to two life events, not necessarily 100% the pandemic itself, but I was definitely related to that time period.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, launching this show, and I saw June of 2020 is you launched your podcast, right? And so what were you starting to notice in the market that led you to start creating this type of content?
Well, I had a mentor. So I had a paid mentor. It was one of the things that even back in 2018, I was mentioned, hey, listen, Billy, if you have a thought about something, if you want to be able to share your ideas, your thoughts, this is a great way to think about doing that, to go and start a podcast. And I thought, yeah, it looks really cool. I should do it. I really want to do it, but I never made the time. I always had the time. I just never made the time to actually start the podcast because I was enjoying my day role. So my job during the day so much that all those priorities kept overtaking my own personal kind of priorities and life priorities. And so it was, it was just one of those things where I continued to build towards the corporate dream rather than building my own dream. And then eventually I said to myself, well, you know what? If I don't do it now, while I'm literally locked in, I don't have the opportunity to do anything else. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, if you don't do it now, when are you actually going to do it? And when I realized that it was now or never, it was the time to say, okay, listen, now is when I'm actually going to go ahead and do this. Even though I'd heard about it for two and a half years before from a mentor, that was the moment for me in my life, in my circumstance, was the time to actually say, okay, look, I'm going to go out, I'm going to take this risk, and I'm going to go out here and I'm going to start this podcast. And so that's a little bit about kind of how I got there.
And looking back at the pandemic, and especially during that time, what's one thing you would have done differently?
One thing that I would have done differently during the pandemic, I think if anything that I would have changed during the pandemic is maybe being able to understand a little bit more about where everyone else was in the family, kind of like how the pandemic was really affecting everybody else. Right. Because I knew how it was affecting me. I knew the stress that it was driving on me. I knew I could see that we had to do things in the household that, hey, listen, you need to do a little bit more exercise because like talking about my kids, and maybe just checking in a little bit more and seeing how everybody was affected. Because in Europe in general and in Spain specifically, it was such a closed in environment. Like I remember talking to family members back in the US and they're like, yeah, I just got back from a run or we just walked out in the backyard. And it was kind of like, well, yeah, that's not lockdown. That's it's not the concept that I had of lockdown, which was being in a flat in the center of the city and not being able to actually leave the flat. So, but yeah, if I were to do anything different, it would really be to just check in a little bit more. How is everybody else doing? How is this affecting you? But yeah, I think the things that happened during the pandemic, I don't necessarily know if I would change any of them because that's kind of how we get to this point in our lives or how I got to this point in my journey. So
no, definitely.
Does that make sense?
So, it definitely makes sense. And, I love that it's a different perspective being in Europe. Like you mentioned, your concept of lockdown was completely different,
Yeah.
And so like for us, I'm like, I couldn't have imagined not being able to go outside of my apartment,
Yeah,
So
I mean, that was crazy.
that was nuts.
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely like when I think back on it and I go back to some of the videos during the because right at that point everybody's got their iPhones or for their phones or whatever the brand you decide to use. But yeah, there were so many different things, but just having that experience and having lived that experience here was very, very unique because it was literally lockdown, like not leaving your flat. We could go to the grocery store with permission. You go to the drugstore with permission or to the hospital. Other than that, you were not allowed to leave.
Wow. So look, so after being in your industry, like you mentioned, you were there for around 21 years, and then your last company, almost 16 years, you were like, hey, corporate life is no longer for me. So as you mentioned, December 2021, you decided to resign. So ultimately, why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Yeah. And so I just realized that because earlier I said I've been 22 years, but it's actually been living in Europe for like, 22 and 26 in corporate. It's really interesting because you asked the question about like why I ended up leaving, like why corporate life and I decided to kind of separate. Well, the first thing happened actually back in 2012. While I was traveling in corporate, and it's one of these things that just kind of there's a before and after, right? The night before my oldest son's third birthday, I couldn't sleep very well. The reason I couldn't sleep very well is because the next morning I was going on a flight to Frankfurt, Germany for a business meeting. I don't remember the content of the business meeting today, but what I do remember is waking up early that morning, the morning of his birthday, waking up his mom, waking up our 1-year-old, and being able to wake them up so that all four of us could be there to sing happy birthday to him before I ran out the door, got in the elevator, down, dashing to the airport, and then on my flight early that morning. Because that evening, while everybody was blowing out the candles, well, I was at a business meeting. right? And so a lot of times there are choices that we make. Sometimes you just really can't make, you have to be there, and sometimes you don't. But as I was buying into the corporate dream, it was one of those meetings that needed to be there, needed to, meet the right people, see the right people, build those relationships. And I realized afterwards, like, the thing that was the more important to me was making sure that I was present for my son's birthday. And so that was one thing that kind of got me started. And I realized that in order to do that, I couldn't just rely on the income from my job. I had to go out and start to figure out what else can I be doing to generate income so that I'm not 100% dependent on a job that I like, right? Because I liked my job. I really liked my job. I really, really liked it. And I think corporate has so many amazing things to offer. And just in the beginning, I was not navigating it properly for my own life and lifestyle. I was navigating it based on the corporate priorities that I was seeing and all the stuff that I was buying into. So that was the first thing. And I realized I needed to start doing stuff differently. And so I started investing in assets that I could actually have control, or with a team that had control over the assets and had a bunch of different things that could happen. But I started creating different streams of income that were not directly related to me going to work. And fortunately, I've been doing that for about a decade. And then about 10 years later, my father got really, really ill. He had a heart issue. Fortunately, he's doing much better today. He's still with us. But in 2020, the summer of 2021, he started getting really, really ill. I remember being in the hospital with him in the ICU in his post-op. And I thought to myself, you know what? I really like my role. I really like my job, but I don't love it. And I want to be able to have the freedom to travel back and forth between the US and Spain, or between Spain and the US, or Europe and the US. And I'd been doing the work for a decade, investing in different things that were providing me with cash flow and tax benefits. And I was in a position to be able to do that because I'd actually been going into my corporate job for probably 3 or 4 years because I wanted to, not because I had to. And so it was more the fact that I'd lived through the pandemic. It made me much more aware of the things that were important to me. And then even though I liked my job a lot, it took an extreme circumstance like my father's illness to really make me think, do I really want to keep doing this? Do I really want to keep working 60, 70, 80 hours a week to be able to fly to Hawaii once a year and be with everybody else and be recognized and all that kind of stuff? Or do I just simply want to be able to know that I can take a trip on a Tuesday because the flights are much less expensive, and come back the following week because I'm in control of my time, not necessarily continuing to work for money? And so those two different life events, with the pandemic in between, or towards the tail end of that, is really what made me realize that it was time to thank the corporate world for the amazing experience, the contacts, the content, the relationships. But it was time to, move on and do something else. And so, so that's what that was all about.
No, really. And how did it impact you to make that decision? Because what I'm hearing a lot of is that you enjoyed, being in the space, right? And
Yeah.
so to actually now make that call to life events, obviously influencing that,
Yeah.
how did it impact you to make that call?
So in the beginning, it was pretty scary, right? Because, and I was very fortunate, right? It was just typically what happens when you're a top performer, you're a top achiever. You start to believe that the world revolves around you because you're always working on the deals that are the most important, the opportunities. You have the contacts in the C-suite at your client's office. And when you're working behind a globally recognized market leading brand, like the one I was working behind, you can sometimes fall into the misnomer that it's about you. But you always want to remember, when you represent a very, very large brand, the brand gets you in the door. You can create the relationships, but the brand is what really gets you in the door. And so one of the things that happened was when I made that transition, I mean, it was difficult, right? Because you're used to the phone rings, hundreds of times a day, and every single email you're either directly in or copied on because somebody needs your point of view. And you go from that for 16 years to the very next day when you're no longer a part of that, you realize, wow, the machine keeps moving without me. And so there was a bit of, wait, hang on a second, this is going to be kind of different. But then in the same time, all of the valuable skills and process, knowledge, relationship building that I had been doing for the previous 20 some odd years, those same skills now I'm leveraging and being able to use today to serve individuals to really help them get closer to their life's purpose and their life's goals and their life's priorities. So, there were a lot of different things that happened. Those feelings that I had initially eventually were replenished with, hey, listen, you're using a lot of the same skill set, a lot of the same things that you've learned. You just have to pivot. And it's okay if your phone's not ringing off the hook every day, all day, or if you're not getting copied on 160 mails a day. Life can still continue to move forward. And some would even say you can have more quality of life, even though you don't have the same quantity of inputs on a day-to-day basis. So that's at least from my experience, that's a little bit about how it happened, how I felt, and even how I continue to live through life post corporate.
No, that's great to hear. And so would love to talk a little bit now about your business, right? So we talk about, always love to hear what's happened next, right? And so tell us more about your company, First Generation Capital Partners.
Yeah. So, one of the things that that typically happens is, like I said, I had this love-hate relationship with money growing up because I saw at the kitchen table, it was a really, really sore subject, because when you don't have it and you need it, or you want it and you don't have it, then it's bad. Right. And so I didn't grow up with the privilege of being able to talk about things like, you're even a 401k or an IRA, or heaven forbid, you start talking about things like trusts and whether they're revocable or irrevocable, and the tax benefits and all of these different things that many people get a chance to talk about at the kitchen table. I didn't do that. So I kind of had to learn, and a lot of it was by making mistakes early on. And so, one, being able to learn how to kind of save money, and then after saving money, learn how to invest money. Because Brian, when I grew up, I thought that just the way that I grew up, when you had money in the bank at the end of the month, I thought that was investing. Just to give you an idea of where I come from. Like, I didn't realize that was called savings, and savings was used for a very specific purpose. And then there are other types of funds that are used for investing purposes, i.e. potentially losing all of them, but they're for a different purpose. Right. And so coming from that background, I realized that, you know what, I had the thing with my son's third birthday, and I wanted to start to learn, because also too, I'm one of these people that I like to be able to have control. I like to get actively involved in things, because that's how I learn better. And so I went outside of a realm that I was used to, which was a 401k, IRA, mutual funds, and stocks. And I started investing in things that you could actually touch and feel, like a home that was at 123 Main Street, right? Not really 123 Main Street, but it had a physical location, because it gave me much more control, and the outcomes, the cash it was producing, helped me realize that in the short term, it could allow me to have more freedom to choose what I wanted to do when I wanted to do that. Then I went from real estate to invest, like doing it actively, like living in Barcelona, Spain, and buying properties that were back in the United States, setting up processes, not focusing so much on the property, but really on the process, which helped. It's also like business building, which was fantastic. But then I started realizing there were other types of assets that I could also invest in that were tangible, that you could know exactly where they were located, different things like ATM machines, hotels, and building up that knowledge base, and doing it from one, just book reading, watching YouTube, listening to podcasts and things like that. And eventually started realizing that, wow, this was the path that helped me to be able to continue to go into my corporate role for the last 4 years, not necessarily 3 or 4 years, not necessarily needing to, but because I wanted to go there. And realizing that I'm something that's someone who is a first generation accredited investor. And for those who may not know what an accredited investor is, because I didn't know what this was. So Brian, if you allow me to at least share what this was, because I was an accredited investor for a couple of years and I didn't know that. It's someone who, when you are earning more than $200,000 a year as an individual, or as a couple, more than $300,000 a year, and you've done that for the previous 2 years and are reasonably expected to do it this year, or you have $1 million of net worth, or you've taken some very specific tests, like that puts you in a very specific accredited investor class, right? And that means that you gain access to very specific type of investments that will allow you to create even more optionality for yourself. And so, to answer your question, kind of where I came from to where we are today, like my business is focusing on helping people who are first generation accredited investors. I mean, you may be listening to this right now and you didn't even know you were an accredited investor. Don't worry, you're not alone. I was an accredited investor for a while and I had no idea. But once you know, then it's about what are you going to do next? Are you taking action so that you can change your situation, improve your situation? And so that's really what we're doing today at First Generation. First Generation Capital Partners is helping those first generation accredited investors be able to create more options for your life, and doing that by investing in assets that are real assets that you can touch, you can feel, you can understand. And so that's a little bit of the background. So hopefully that makes sense, Brian. And if not, please feel free to ask me any kind of clarifying questions.
No, that was great. That was actually one of my questions too about the accredited investor piece. So I'm glad that you kind of gave that rundown. And I'll likely when I send this out, I'm gonna maybe put a little something together so that people can visually see what an accredited investor actually is and why it's important. So that's awesome.
Okay.
And now,
we've actually, and I know you'll put that together, but we've on our website at firstgencp.com/blog. The very first blog is actually about accredited investors. And so you can go there, firstgencp.com/blog, go to the very first one. It is, what is an accredited investor, or, and why is that important? So also,
awesome.
If you want to link there, you can link there as well.
You just saved me a ton of work. So,
okay, there you go.
I love that. I love that.
See, just trying to help, man.
I love that. I love it. So now, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Obviously, we've been talking about the business, but we talked about the podcast. And so, obviously, you're on my podcast now, so I very much appreciate it. This podcast community, as I've been growing my own show, it's just so warm and welcome, right? And now you've got over 280 episodes. You host the Going Long podcast. I mean, it's a hell of a record, right? And so just to keep going in that direction. So tell us a little bit more about the show and really what listeners can expect to learn from your program.
Yeah, sure. So initially, and I appreciate that, by the way, we're almost at episode 300. So when people are listening to this, which we will have the only guests that have ever been on my show 3 times. Anyone who's ever been there has only been once. There are only 2 people who have been there now. It will be the 3rd time. They happen to share my last name. And so they're a lot smaller than me, but their brains are really, really big. So if you want to check out episode 300, hopefully it will be out by the time you listen to this. But I mean, the podcast, and it goes back to what we were talking about before. It was one of these epiphanies that happened during the pandemic. There was never an idea for the podcast to be in the top 1.5% of podcasts globally, because, according to a website called listennotes.com, they talk about that. And so it was really about, how can I also share my experience helping other people that are, right? Because at the time, Brian, I was, and still am, living in Europe, but I was investing in assets that were literally over 9,000 miles away, right? And so when I was getting into that space of real estate, the idea was, well, hang on a second, you need to be able to drive to the property in like 2 seconds, because you've got to be able to fix everything when it breaks and all that kind of stuff. And I was literally doing it from 9,000 miles away. Since the pandemic, right, a lot of people realize, well, hey, you can actually utilize technology to leverage and have somebody else go check out the property while you're sitting in your room in, I don't know, Abu Dhabi, and you're looking at a property that's in, I don't know, Dallas, Fort Worth. Like, that's possible. Like, I was doing that pre-pandemic. And so the podcast gave the opportunity to have other people who were doing something very similar, experts in different real asset classes, to be able to share their experience with people that were interested in, you like your job, you like your day job, but you realize there's something else outside of Wall Street. You didn't just want to have this constant up and down of, if the stock market's going well, you're feeling great. And when the stock market's in the tank, you're feeling terrible. And you didn't have to make your geography or where you lived the most important criteria for where you were investing. And so just kind of started with a couple of people that I knew, industry experts. And then, it was probably during the pandemic, I don't know, I think we did 20 to 30 episodes. And then after that, we're almost at 300 now. And it's really enjoying it a lot. I'm sure that there's, like anything else, and I'm sure you will see exactly the same. Like, at a certain point, when your audience, when your listener family wants to do something new or different, you also adapt that, right? And it's one of the things that we constantly get feedback. We ask for support. And by the way, Brian, and I know that I'm kind of doing this at the end, or towards the end, but if you are continuing to invest your time and energy here with Brian, every single episode, and you have not taken just a couple seconds to leave him an honest written review as well as a rating and what you think about the podcast, could you please do that? Like, it's really important as a fellow podcaster to make sure that you take I don't know, maybe it's 15 seconds to leave him an honest written review as well as a rating, because it's also going to help him to be able to attract even more guests that are going to give you what you need. So take just a couple seconds to make sure that you leave that honest written review as well as a rating for the Why I Left podcast, because that will be very, very helpful for you as more than anything else, and also will help Brian and the team. So yeah, so a little bit. I know I kind of go on and on about the podcast stuff, but that's a little bit about kind of where it started, what we're doing, and most importantly, leave Brian an honest written review as well as rating. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that, man. And that was unsolicited. So I definitely appreciate that. And, now a part of the show, as we kind of begin some of the wrap up, I'd love to get advice from our guests to folks who are listening. Right. And so I love the explanation around what an accredited investor is and why that's important. Right. And so I appreciate you mentioning that. And so for those folks, let's say for other high earners who may be looking for better ways to invest their money, what's the framework that you use to help guide their next steps?
Yeah. So one of the things that, and it's really, really interesting, right? Because depending on where you come from, your mind is already open to receiving certain types of inputs or not, right? And it's not something that you can, it depends on what family you were born into, what the thought process was, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times when you are told to just put your money somewhere, don't worry about it, let somebody else manage it, and you just keep working, like that's just what you do. So most people, what I found is that you will ask them, hey, listen, how is your portfolio XYZ doing? Not sure, gonna have to ask my financial advisor. Okay. It's almost like thinking, okay, well, it's like me asking, how are your children doing? And you say, well, I don't know, you have to ask somebody else. Well, no, you would really want to understand how something that is providing you life, how it's performing, right? And so as you start to realize, like, where is, what are the different types of assets that you have at your disposition, like you have to really understand what is happening with them first and foremost, but from your own lens. But what I would say is when you start to have the curiosity that, okay, well, maybe there is a different way to do it. It doesn't just have to be like set it and forget it. And because you see other people that are in the same job with you that are living a lifestyle and having different options than you do, then your curiosity maybe start to say, well, what is this person doing a little bit differently? And so one of the biggest things that I started realizing was, as someone who's a high wage earner, right? Without a doubt, one of the largest ways that you do not keep your money is because typically, this is very US centric, Uncle Sam is in your pocket, right? Most of the time, and I dealt with a lot of people that are in the sales world, right? And so a lot of times people always tell you, hey, listen, I made this major deal. I got this massive bonus check. And the bonus check was, and I'll just use an example, right? The bonus check was $800,000. Wow, it was amazing. Enterprise software, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe it's 400,000. Well, what people don't typically tell you is it's only half of that, because between your state and federal government, they've taken the taxes out of that. So you did all that work and you got half of the reward. Why am I saying that? Well, because it's about when you're starting to look at different investment opportunities, you say, okay, well, is it more important to make 4%, or is it more important this year to be able to keep, I don't know, 30%, 40% of whatever salary you earn? And if you can actually use that same capital today, then you're thinking differently. It probably feels really weird because it's not something that you heard about or talked about at the table, but that's where the education comes in and the relationship building comes in. So I would say, look at things from a different perspective. If you already have that intuition inside that there are more opportunities to create optionality for yourself outside of Wall Street, but you need to have the exposure. Number one, you're already here watching, listening to Brian. You're hearing what we're talking about. You've already been told about going to the firstgencp.com /blog place to learn about what an accredited investor is. Go down that track, because it all starts with education. And then once you get educated, then it's about being able to take action and being able to have exposure to different type of investment opportunities, because those investment opportunities, they don't just create money, they help you keep more. And when you're able to keep more, it creates options for your life. And I think that that's the most important thing, not just the money that's sitting in the bank. And that comes from a perspective, Brian, of someone who really grew up with a love-hate relationship with money, because of the pain that I saw that it caused my family members. So hopefully that answers the question. And if not, feel free to ask anything else. I'll dive a
Yeah.
little deeper if you want.
No, definitely. I think that definitely is a good springboard for what folks can do, when they're in that space and looking for more than either the savings rate, or who knows what the APR is now, which is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Ridiculously low,
Yeah.
and then dealing with potentially either IRAs or other things like that. So no, without a doubt.
Yeah, you know, if you don't mind, just really one thing, because you just mentioned something, right? So, and this is one of the things that happens, because like people talk about inflation. I don't know exactly where it is, like the specific point, but you just talked about the interest rate. So imagine you're using an interest rate, and you're getting an interest rate today that is, I don't know, 1%. Well, when inflation is at 9%, if you just keep your money in the bank, by definition, you are losing 8% in this very simple example, right? Because the cost to purchase whatever, your purchasing power, you're losing it by 8% per year. So if you just keep that money in the bank, imagine for 5 years, that difference between 1% and 9%, then we're going to imagine that it stays the same for 5 years. Like, you've lost 40% of your purchasing power, which at the end of the day is the thing that's the most important. It's how can you use the capital to purchase the things that you need, or the experiences that you want to provide yourself and others. And it's something that, you brought it up. So I just wanted to use that as a very, very specific example about how you can start to think about things differently. Don't just think that 9% inflation is no big deal. Well, it's a big deal because you feel it every single day that you go to the grocery store. But more importantly, if you're storing money in the bank at 1 or even 2%, then, you're losing every single year your ability to create new experiences for others.
Definitely. And so when you think about this, what is that type of impact you're hoping to have in this next chapter of your professional life, or as you continue down this path in your professional life?
Yeah, we have a very clear goal to be able to serve 200 additional accredited investor family members. Like, that's very specifically what we want and will do. And we will do that through being able to share information here, being able to have conversations, create new exposure, education, so that those additional 200 investor family members can create new options for themselves, and most importantly, for the people that they love. So that's our very clear goal. That's what we are going to achieve, and what we're on the path to achieving.
I like that. Well, Billy, look, I learned a ton, right? And so I just want to thank you for taking some time to join the show today. Look, I found out about you after you appeared on Matt Doan's Uncage Yourself podcast, right?
Yeah, shouts out to Matt. Yeah.
Big shout out to Matt. It was a great discussion. He actually joined us here for episode 40, right? And so, and I learned a ton from him as well. Yeah. And so I'm glad, that we connected. I loved hearing your story, and would love for you to share again, where can our listeners support you?
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned it at the very top. One of the things you could do, especially if so let's say you're an accredited investor and you are listening to, based on what we talked about before, or you've gone to the blog already, you want to find out more about how we're specifically helping you get to your state of optionality, is you can go to firstgencp.com/paylesstax. Once again, firstgencp.com/paylesstax. Find out specifically how we're helping people. You also, I like LinkedIn, and I'm usually super, super active there, and will be super active. And probably by the time you're listening to this, we'll be doing that as well. One thing I would ask is just let me know that you've already listened to Brian and I have a conversation here. Send me a personalized invitation on LinkedIn. Let you know that, hey, we're all already listened to the Why I Left podcast. Would be great. And aside from that, I think you'd already mentioned it, the Going Long podcast with Billy Keels. If you're in your corporate role, you really believe that you're in like a city like New York, Chicago, LA, and you want to be able to invest in other places, we have fantastic experts that are there that share their experience in a lot of different real assets that can help you to create more options for your life. So I would say any of those are probably the best way to check us out or find out more about me or what we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Billy Keels for joining me today, dropping some major gems, major knowledge, right? So I'll be sure to share all of his information in our show notes. So look, I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Billy, thanks again.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.